when we take communion, it's not like baptism, but it almost is an outward sign that I'm saying, okay, I'm a believer. I am listening to what we read, and I'm saying, okay, I'm praying and making sure that my heart is right where it needs to be, and that I'm remembering that the only reason I can pray and do that is because of what Jesus did.
Welcome back to Table Talk this Tuesday. We are so glad that you could join us. And also at the table this Tuesday, we are so glad that Billy Bowen could join us. Billy?
Good to have you, Billy.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. We've known Billy, Mariana for, how many years have you guys been at River Oaks?
13
14
years, something like that now.
13 years. And I know from the T-shirt I see you in often on Sunday mornings, that much like our guest last Sunday, you guys have spent some time in Kids Rock. You work with children's ministry a good bit.
Yes. Our son Mason, who's 12 now, we started serving in there just before he was born, and stayed with him in Kids Rock until he moved up and out of there. Or I'm sorry, we stayed with him in Noah's Ark. Until he moved to Kids Rock, and we even went there for a little while.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. That's so helpful, and I know you've impacted not only his growth and development, and training and wisdom, but so many others too. So we appreciate it. And in spirit of transparency, Billy, Marianne have also been in our small group for many years now. Right. So I've come to really appreciate your insight and your engagement with Scripture, and look forward to our talk today.
Yeah, me too. Billy. You know, everything I learned, I got from small groups. So.
Well, wow, there's a plug. We have Taste of Community coming up in August. So you also can join a small group. David, welcome.
Good to be here.
Yeah,
good to be here.
What a wonderful message Sunday. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
It just really tied in. I believe we had a lot of conversations, a lot of other classes that were going on, the whole idea of redemption and just the way it worked in communion, and that's what we're going to see and talk about today. So thank you. It was really resonated. So I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So as we just get into it today on Table Talk, the passage, David, that you looked at really picked up verse 7 of chapter 22. Luke 22, verse 7. But I also think it's important that we set the biblical context, the circumstances that we enter into this very well-known episode for most, the upper room. What's going on just prior to this? Where are we? Billy, do you have any thoughts on where we are? How do you set the scene, so to speak?
It's what we call the Passion Week.
Okay. Yeah.
So Jesus is winding down his teaching, moving towards the cross. Yeah. And I feel like the disciples are finally starting to get an idea who he really is. Yeah. Not completely sometimes yet, but they're starting to get it.
Yeah.
And figure out that I think some of them have kind of figured it out already, exactly, that he's not just their teacher.
Yeah.
But the others are starting to figure out, okay, this might not be a regular rabbi.
Yeah, and that's interesting because when we read it, David, like Billy said, it's Passion Week, Passover week, so to speak, a pilgrimage festival in Jerusalem, a lot of crowds. And so these first few verses in 22 tell us about that. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near. It's called Passover. And then we're told the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him, Jesus, to death, for they feared the people. This isn't a surprise to us, though. We've seen this already. The chief priests and the why was that the case, David? Why? Seems like it should be a peaceful week.
Should be. I think they were threatened by him.
Okay.
Upsetting the religious order.
Yeah.
Essentially chipping away at their authority over the people with his message.
Yeah. Well, and we've actually been in the last few weeks. He cleanses the temple, and then they say, well, after that, they're looking to how they can harm him, how they can persecute him, and then they try to entrap him. Last week we had the questions. I believe it was trying to entrap Jesus, and so they are definitely looking to I think, catch him in blasphemy more than anything, right? And then convict him on that. So there's that tension that's going on. That's sort of going outside the walls. And then inside the wall, back to Billy, what you mentioned, that you would have thought all of these disciples were sort of coming to a point of revelation. This is where we're told Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away, conferred with these chief priests, right, who were looking for Jesus, and how he might betray them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money, so he considered and sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. A very well-known betrayal. Before we look at the Lord's Supper, upper room, Satan entered Judas. Is this more than just temptation? Is this what do you make of that, David or Billy?
Well, some might say it's a figure of speech in that he influenced him, but I would probably tend to take it more literally. I mean, an evil spirit can possess a person. I do not believe Judas was saved. He's called elsewhere the son of perdition, the son of destruction. And so it was known, Jesus knew from the beginning who would betray him, knew it was Judas. And he was the counterfeit amongst the disciples. Okay. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Billy, you familiar with...
No, and I agree, but it's still always interesting to me when I read this part that one of those people that were the closest to Jesus, that Satan could still influence in that way. Yeah. So, I mean, what does that mean about us who are so far removed from Jesus?
Yeah. It's a warning, right? I mean, it's a warning. The devil prowling lion, that sort of thing as well. It seems like some of this is happening. And so, so this is all kind of going on when we get into this passage beginning in verse 7 through verse 13. Billy, would you read that for us?
Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover.
Okay, we'll stop there because I just want to speak to the idea of the Passover. We're not going to go into all the details. We've had teachings on those, and we'll talk about that later. But have either of you participated in a traditional Jewish Passover Seder?
Not completely participated, but a friend of mine that I graduated from high school with, her family was, fundamental Jewish. Okay. And so it's around, I think, isn't it around Easter time? I can't.
Yeah. It's a spring, March. Yeah.
Right. And so I think we were doing other stuff at their house. Okay. And some of that was going on. And so I got to see just small bits and pieces of all kinds of celebrations with them through the years. Through different holidays, because they overlap a lot of our holidays now. Sure. So I got to see bits and pieces, but never fully participated. No.
David?
Yes. So long ago, I don't remember the details of it. I think it was over 20 years ago.
Okay. It's I do think it's important that we sort of have a view to what was going on at the Passover and the Passover meal for it to really fully make sense of what Jesus says and what he does. So I have not either. I would love to have studied it and feel like I've lived vicariously through the teachings and all that goes on at a Passover meal. But I also find it interesting that it's important to know that Jesus practiced these feasts and festivals.
Right.
And does that mean we should?
Well, Christian Jews do still celebrate Passover Seders. I think, and it's good to do that if you understand that the Messiah has come. Okay. That the fulfillment has come.
They've been fulfilled.
Right.
Yeah.
If you approach it with the understanding that Jesus has come as the Messiah, the Passover lamb.
Yeah.
then I think it's fine.
That's right. Yeah. So just an interesting point here. There were the 3 pilgrimage feasts, and this is why everyone had gathered there, right? Passover, Pentecost, and then Tabernacles, which were all harvest feasts.
Right.
So to your point, Passover is the spring harvest, so it's always around this time of the year. And Leviticus 23 gives us the outline of what these should look like, if you want to read up on exactly how to practice them. But it also, Moses said, this will be your first month of the year with the Passover. So it's basically the first day almost. Jesus also practiced Hanukkah, which I think is great. Feast of Dedication in John 10 we see. So just all that to say, Jesus is going about practicing and being observant of all that had been commanded. Okay. And so they prepare for this Passover meal. And David, why don't you continue reading there where he sort of changes it up a bit now.
Starting in verse 14?
Yeah, 14 through 20. Let's go with that.
When the hour came, he reclined at table and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which is for you, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed.
Yeah. So the institution of what we've come to know as the Lord's Supper or communion or the Eucharist, we see here. So I think to really talk through this, we have to understand what is Jesus now, how is he changing this up? How is he instituting something different than a Passover? And really maybe with the elements, right, Billy? Or any thoughts on what you see here that...
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Jesus is still celebrating the Passover. Mm-hmm. And much like he says the new covenant, he's making the old Passover become just a tradition.
Okay.
To me. And the new celebration is kind of what David spoke about in his sermon. It's a celebration of the now and the future.
Yeah.
Whereas the other was more of the past.
Yeah.
It's still kind of the same, but he's saying you don't need this one anymore. You don't need a lamb's blood on your lintel, which is a word still. But now it's my blood, and you don't have to put it anywhere. I do all the work. Yeah. It's the same idea.
How about that? Yeah, and to your point, too, Billy, it's they were actually following through with the right food items and the 4 cups that would have been prepared, and even the statement that after they had eaten, he took the cup, which would have made it the 3rd cup of the meal. And even in that, I think it's interesting because for those who practice Judaism, the 3rd cup is often referred to as a cup of redemption, a cup of salvation, followed by the 4th cup, which he says he's not going to partake again, or he goes to the garden and says, take this cup as a cup of praise. Halal. But following through, he just says, okay, this is now a different meaning, and that meaning, David, is tied in directly with what he's about to do, what we're about to see on the cross.
Yes.
What do we mean by that? What is the bread and the wine now? Why would that now represent the cross?
Well, it's interesting. It harkens back to something he said in John chapter 6 that was really troubling for people. In John chapter 6, it's worth looking at. I didn't take the time to get into that yesterday, but it's where Jesus essentially says, unless you eat my flesh and drink of my blood, you don't have any place in me. And John 6:53, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And people were bothered by that. Mm-hmm. In fact, verse 60 says, when his disciples heard it, they said, this is a hard saying, who can listen to it? But Jesus will go on to explain in verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is of no help at all. the words that I've spoken to you are spirit and life. And so we don't literally, physically eat the flesh of, Christ. The bread represents his body given for us, and the wine or juice represents his blood shed for us.
Okay.
And we do this in remembrance of what he's done until he comes.
You made a big point of that yesterday, the remembrance and the looking forward. Is that something, Billy, you've always seen in that or thought about?
No, I knew it was part of it, but I always think of it more as a looking back to what Jesus did for us, rather than thinking of it as a promise of what's to come.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know. That could just be tradition.
Did you happen to grow up in a church that had a communion table and an inscription on the front?
I grew up in the South at a Baptist church, so of course.
And that inscription said,
do this in remembrance of me.
Yeah.
And that's all it said.
That's
I mean,
all
it was
it
around the
said.
sides. There were other words, but that's what was always facing you when you're sitting there.
Yeah. And I think it was maybe Andrew who suggested this once. And I like even beyond that, and I've never thought about that, but not only the looking back or the looking ahead, but there's also an aspect that by the common union of looking around. Mm-hmm. So to me, I always try to present the Lord's Supper as the time that we come to celebrate, that reverence of looking back to the cross, but also that celebration of looking around in the present, and then also that anticipation of looking forward to his return. And that's helped me, I think, really sort of engage with or maybe a more rich partaking of that. But certainly Jesus is saying, look back, look ahead, and to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Very fascinating with that. And then the last point to hear in this passage before we look at our essential element, he makes note of this new covenant in my blood. Covenant language. What does he mean by that? Is he just the new covenant in my blood, the cup that's poured out for you? What do we make of that?
I was going to leave that to you two guys. You're the scholars
Covenantal
here.
Covenantal theology.
Yeah.
Professor David Beaty.
Yeah, I haven't had that class yet.
No, when I hear that word, I often think of the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 9 and verse 15 says, "Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant."
Okay.
So in this new covenant, he's done it all. We get it all.
Yeah.
The inheritance, not only the salvation, but the promised eternal inheritance of the Son of God in which we share.
Yeah.
The covenant refers to an agreement, a solemn agreement made by God with us,
and which
with Christ, and through on the basis of the blood of Christ.
The blood of Christ,
right.
and really, if there's a new, then that refers to an old, and the old is really that covenant under the law that had been given, and which was impossible to keep. So simply a covenant of grace, saved by faith even then. But Jesus makes clear now that the agreement is as a result of the blood I shed for you.
Right.
That word redemption again, the price I've paid for you and ransomed you.
Yeah.
That we can be saved through that. Okay. Well, that's always, we always get to that, and it always seems to, the bread, great, the body, the blood, the wine, the new covenant, and it's very important that he said that in there. Obviously,
and to me, it's something I think we've talked about in small group.
Yeah.
The old covenant was strictly with the Jewish people.
Okay.
Right, with the descendants of Abraham.
Yeah.
The new covenant is with anybody who believes. So there needed to be a new one. There's no way the rest of us could ever follow the old covenant. Even if there was some way we could possibly keep half of the rules, we could never be part of it.
And now there is neither Jew nor Gentile. Yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah, and in fact, that was something that even David had pointed to from an all nations, all peoples, Messiah and God coming to faith through the covenant language. Well, wonderful. Well, hey, what a great passage. And we see, a lot of times when we celebrate communion, we read it out of Paul's letter to the Corinthians.
Right.
1 Corinthians 11 is where that he had received, that he had where the apostles had shared, passed down what Jesus did on this last night. And so we see this passage again, and that's really where we generally reference it. But so that brings us to the essential moment. And as we've been looking at these just fundamental, foundational truths to our faith, how do we help explain them? How do we help understand them? In very basic ways, essential ways. We've looked at salvation, justification. We looked at redemption last week. We've looked at the kingdom of God. Probably makes sense this week to talk about communion, the Lord's Supper. If you're someone who's not yet a believer and you show up on a Sunday morning and it's a morning that we're partaking, observing the Lord's Supper, that can be confusing, I would think. If that's what you experience and you don't really know much beyond that. So there's many ways we can talk about it. We've had some classes and all, and I guess the understanding is that there are 4 views to communion in the Lord's Supper of the Eucharist. 3 Protestant views of communion and 1 Roman Catholic view of communion. 4 prominent views. There's probably others, but let's not talk about all those. Let's talk about River Oaks. What are we doing when we take communion in its basic form? What does that mean, Billy? As a member, as a member,
Thanks,
when we serve communion, what is it? What is it meaning? You've talked about looking back, but
and I think for me, I don't think you can ever. You can try, but I don't know that you can ever separate your background from your current, because and I think you do also. My wife, Mariana, is Catholic. So, and then me growing up Baptist, our ideas of communion from the past are different. But for me, it's when we take communion, it's not like baptism, but it almost is an outward sign that I'm saying, okay, I'm a believer. I am listening to what we read, and I'm saying, okay, I'm praying and making sure that my heart is right where it needs to be, and that I'm remembering that the only reason I can pray and do that is because of what Jesus did.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful, Billy. David, how would you express what's going on when we take communion?
Well, frankly, I'm not sure I fully understand what's going on. I think in the Protestant, varied views, there's the sense that we're not eating the literal flesh.
Right.
The elements are not being transformed into the literal body of Christ. However, the Lord is present in a way that is significant. He's always present with us. But when we take communion, I say that in part because of the warning Paul gives.
Okay.
You take it wrongly. Without judging ourselves, we can come under a judgment. And so that's the negative side of it. The positive side of it is taking it properly. There are spiritual benefits of which we partake. Some refer to it as the Lord's presence being there in communion influentially, kind of like the presence of the sun gives warmth and light and so forth. So I don't really know how to put it into words. I just think it's beautiful, special, because he has decreed it, commanded it. There's something significant happening. It should never be taken lightly or without real, to the degree we can have understanding of it.
And so
understanding.
In that, we would say it's more than just a memorial.
More than just a memorial. If you say just remember, I remember, something happened. I'd say more than just a remembrance.
Right. Okay.
That's my opinion.
And it's certainly worship, which is really what you were describing, Billy. And it's confirming our union with Christ.
And it's community worship.
Yes. Yeah.
Also. Yes, that's a good point.
It's a meal.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's right.
That's one that's often not talked about, is the participation in the one body.
That's right.
Communion.
And that's really what Paul was getting on to the Corinthians about. He was saying there were some who were coming early and eating it all, and some who weren't eating at home, and they were just making it their meal, because it was traditionally more of a larger piece of bread than a little wafer, right? I mean, there was usually some bread involved in breaking of and that sort of thing. So many were using it as a meal. And Paul was saying, wait, this is worship. What do you do? And keeping others from taking it. And so, yeah, that's a really important one body aspect to it too that, yeah, we definitely have to see. Spiritual presence is what I think we would say is the view. Again, something is happening, and where we can see and understand the benefits of grace that we receive. We're the beneficiary of because of what Christ did on the cross for us. Right. Last question, and again, David, unless Billy's really got some insight on this one, we take it once a month.
Right.
Why is that? Why once a month? Is there anything seemingly
it's a nice compromise between once a quarter and once a week.
Okay.
I do think there are churches that take it weekly.
Right.
And I think there's a danger there of it becoming just another part of the service and not quite as special.
Okay.
Once a quarter to me doesn't seem like quite enough, especially if you happen to miss that day when you do your quarterly communion.
Yeah.
But once a month, if you're a regular attendee, I think it's significant. So it's just, there's no rule that we have to take it so often. That's just kind of where we've landed. Yeah. We also do communion special events, like we'll have a Maundy Thursday service before Easter.
Okay.
Christmas Eve typically we'll take. Right. So there's some special events in between too.
Sure. 14, 15 times a year typically.
Yeah, that's about right.
And
that's about right.
And we would say we were careful about just haphazardly serving or practicing communion. There's nothing special about mediating it, officiating necessarily, but we are very careful about where it takes place and is it worship.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. So, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you,
David, for that.
Thank you, David.
One thing I'll say too is that doing it once a month versus the once a week. If we're trying to do what we're so called to do and bring new people to the church, they may not feel comfortable at first with communion. And if we're doing it every week, are they ever going to feel like they can be comfortable and figure out what's going on and what's going on inside them without having to feel obligated about this thing that they don't understand yet at every service.
Well, and sometimes you hear it and you may be visiting and you know in some churches you might have to walk forward or you might, and so again, understanding that too helps us.
And in fact, I'm just thinking, Billy, when you said that, I think when we first started our church, we were seeing so many new people coming who, and among them so many not yet believers, that we didn't even do communion on Sunday morning. We did special evening services for communion. I think that's what we did.
Wow.
Our first year or two.
Yeah.
Till we could get a handle on who was there.
Sure. Well, and lastly too, because this might be important for someone out here, we typically partake the third. When is communion?
Usually the first.
The first baptism's
communion.
The third. Yeah. Communion the first Sunday of the month.
Typically.
Yes. That's a general sort of understanding. First Sunday of the month. And you have to be a member of River Oaks to participate.
No.
Good. Okay.
No, not at all.
Being a member of River Oaks doesn't even mean you know that it's the first Sunday.
That's right. Well, I think we've just confirmed that, haven't we? Yeah.
That's right.
Even a member of the staff, even an ordained pastoral staff who's led communion before. I think we've confirmed that.
Every Sunday's the first Sunday of the month. A believer, someone who would confess Jesus as Lord, believe, confess, would say that they are a follower of Jesus. That's the only criteria. That's the one body criteria. We don't fence the table.
And that's what we suggest for parents with young children as well.
That was going to be my question.
They not just think, hey, I'm 3 years old and I want that snack too. They need to understand. And the parent's in the best position, but we're available to help them to make that decision if need be. But a child should understand the significance of it.
Fantastic. Well, good. Well, I hope that was helpful. I hope it's helpful online as well. And Billy, thanks for joining us this week.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank each of you. And next week, we're going to be back. We'll continue in chapter 22 with an infamous betrayal, a garden arrest, and a 3-time denial. Until then, blessings, friends.